The four main white groups of the South included planters, which owned 20 or more slaves, small slaveholders, the human farmers, which were the family farmers, and the pine barrens. The Old South was split into two, the Upper South, consisting of Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Arkansas, and the Lower or Deep South, South Carolina, Georgia, Florida, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and Texas. Two giant cash crops dominated agriculture in the Lower South. One was cotton, and the other was sugar. The Upper South grew hemp, wheat, tobacco, and vegetables. The profitability of cotton and sugar increased the value of slaves throughout the entire region and encouraged the internal slave trade from the Upper to the Lower South. One observer stated, without the sale of slaves to the Lower South, Virginia would be a desert. The dependence on slavery was great in the South. Because slavery was profitable, the South became more reliant on slavery to promote economic expansion. There were even biblical references that slavery was okay, and scientific studies showed that whites were greater than blacks. Slaves were a form of social status. The more slaves you had, the more wealthy you were. Owning slaves showed your wealth. Even so, most whites did not own slaves. Field slaves did the physical labor outside, while the house slaves were like spies and could provide information to the other slaves, even though they had very little privacy. Religion kept slaves alive, and at night was when slaves had free time. They would take part in circle dancing and group singing. Slaves lived in quarters where they would see their family. Slave owners had powerful incentives to encourage slave marriages. 1, to bring new slaves into the world, and 2, to discourage slaves from running away from their plantations. But with marriage, slaves knew they would lose their family to the internal slave trade. Many slave women were forced to have sex with the master. These women faced sexual exploitation as well as resentment from the white wives. Among the greatest sorrows of some plantation mistresses was the presence of mulatto children who stood as daily reminders of their husbands' infidelities. Slave women had double the work, taking care of their own children as well as the master's children. Workers would walk among the slaves with a whip. The lash did not always fall lightly. The annals of American slavery contain stories of repulsive brutality. Drivers sometimes forced pregnant slave women to lie in depressions in the ground while enduring the whip on their backs. The disciplining and punishment of slaves were often left to the white overseers and black drivers rather than to the masters. Because slaves outnumbered the whites, brutality was used to cause fear in the slaves. Slave resistance consisted of sabotage when the slaves would stop working in the fields. Slaves also would run away, though it was difficult and rare that slaves would escape from their plantations. For the slaves that chose to escape, some former slaves, and one by the name Harriet Tubman, made repeated trips back to the South to help other slaves escape. These methods of escape fed the legend of the Underground Railroad. The Underground Railroad was an organized network of safe houses owned by white abolitionists who spirited blacks to freedom in the North and Canada. This escape to freedom was a dream rather than an alternative for most blacks. Out of millions of slaves, probably fewer than 1,000 escaped to the North. A distinctive culture emerged among blacks in the slave quarters of antebellum plantations. Enslaved blacks gave a distinctive twist to the American as well as African components of their culture. Slaves gave a new language, African American religion, black music, and dance to America.